Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. Welcome to the Wasatch Report. I am Suzanne Sherman, and this is the Cerberus Radio Network, defending freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny. It is Friday, March 2nd, 2018. We are live, and I have a special guest today. We've had some really heavy hitters coming on this week. Ryan McMacken was with me on, I believe it was Monday. I had Jim Bovard. Ryan was also, by the way, from Mises Institute. And Jim Bovard yesterday was, who is a writer from The Hill. We talked about Waco. Jeff and I, and we also had our hosts from one of the hosts from our network on the show, The Other Side, Mike and I, we discussed what is wrong with the school system and should teachers be armed. Just trying to give you a feel for what we're doing here. We're covering angles of issues in the news that the mainstream media is not getting into in great deal. I feel they're doing a tremendous disservice by glossing over many of these important topics. We're trying to get you to think. We're trying to get you to change the way you're thinking, because the information presented to you from these outlets is not going to solve the problems we need to solve. That's why we have a show here called The Paradigm Shift. One of the founders of the network, Jeff Johnson, goes live before I do on Monday mornings, and he takes us back. We still have this theory here, or this theme here, 18th century ideas for 21st century thinkers. We look back. He talks about Patrick Henry and other geniuses from the founding generations and applies those thoughts to what we do today. He also has a show, The Renegade and the Rambler, with the other founder of the network, Daniel Bailey. If you tune in, follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. You can get to our radio co-feed and listen as we have these shows presented in a loop, and our live shows are also replayed. You can hear Brushfires of Freedom, Mike Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center. He also has a podcast that he does with Peter Schiff Gold, so you can learn about the pros and cons of investing in gold. We have a lot of stuff for you who are here. Also, reminder, we have a new show, The Other Side. Justin and Michael are public school teachers. They have a plethora of very interesting topics and do a very good job. They also are played on the local radio station out in Indiana where they live. Speaking of also terrestrial radio stations, you can hear me Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock a.m. co-hosting the Inside the News show on K-Talk Radio. If you can't access that because you're far away, the benefits of the internet now, you can just go to their webpage, ktalkmedia.com, and find them there. Also, the shows are archived, so you can look them up. I've also been on Prepper Talk Radio and Shooting You Straight with Maxon and Platts. We actually had Kevin Gutzman join us on there a few weeks ago, and that went over very well. So just think about that and follow us. Listen to our radio co-feed. Tune in to us. We have a YouTube channel, Cerberus Radio Network. Consider subscribing there. Please share the shows. We get a lot of really good feedback, but we need to get our numbers up. This message needs to come out. I get some really, really great thinkers on this show, and I've got one that's going to be joining me today. I have referred to his articles many times. Do we have our guest on the line, Jeff?
Yes, Tom Mullen is on the phone.
Thank you very much. Tom Mullen is a gentleman I have been referring to many times. I've read his articles on here, just like I've had Ryan McMacken on many times before he actually joined us. Tom is the author of Where Do Conservatives and Liberals Come From and Whatever Happened to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Another book, A Return to Common Sense, Reawakening Liberty in the Inhabitants of America. That is right on point, too, with what we're trying to do here. His writing has been featured in Newsweek, Huffington Post, Washington Times, Daily Caller, LouRockwell.com, 321 Gold, and my favorite, Foundation for Economic Education. Tom has been a guest on Fox's Freedom Watch with Judge Andrew Napolitano, Adam versus the Man, Free Talk Live, numerous other programs. Tom, you are out in Buffalo, New York, I believe. How are you? How's the weather treating you out there?
Just another day in March for us up here in Buffalo.
We are absolutely getting hammered with winds right now as we have a storm coming in. I know we have a limited amount of time with you today. That's why I put you up first at the top of the hour. So when we're done here, you can go on and prepare for what else you need to do today. Let's start with, I think we were going to mention a little bit, you follow the news a lot more closely than I do, about the situation with the guns right now. We had a shooting in Florida, and you might want to share with our listeners your thoughts on how a generation of high school children is now being used to put forth the gun control message. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, and I was speculating when I first wrote that article that these kids were probably being manipulated just a little bit. It's since come out. I think there was a BuzzFeed article that confirmed that a lot of people with deep pockets and a lot of people with decades of experience in organizing political campaigns, movements, rallies, are really directing this so-called organic grassroots movement. And, the fact that they're putting children or very young adults, if you want to call a 17-year-old not quite a child anymore, putting them out there to make these, I think the article said, self-assured statements, about things they don't know very much about. To me, that's just really, really shameful. And we know that they probably haven't been taught much about the derivation of the Bill of Rights. Why did they have the Second Amendment? Why do they have the Fourth Amendment? Why do they have the First Amendment? So, we know basically how our kids are being taught these things in the schools, not mine, of course, but it's really a shame. And I hope that people would take a skeptical eye when they see, a bunch of kids getting a donation of $500,000 from Oprah Winfrey. Somebody had Oprah Winfrey's number, her assistant's number. That doesn't just happen all on its own.
I think George Clooney also donated $500,000. But, when we get to the education of these children and what we're taught time and time again, even because I homeschooled my children, time and time again, I would buy materials. And the point that they're saying about the Second Amendment is, well, the founders never foresaw militarized weapons on the streets or people running around with pistols in their neighborhood. So the Second Amendment is something that really needs to be scaled back, or we need to rethink it. Well, we have a process for that. It's called an Article 5 convention, and we can amend the Constitution. But again, we have this indoctrination in the school system that the Second Amendment confers upon us the right to keep and bear arms. And as we all talk about on my show, and we know here, that the Second Amendment, and when I go on the radio shows and I say there is no such thing as a Second Amendment right, you should see the jaws drop by the other hosts when I'm on there. But then I explain, look, the Second Amendment is really understood to be, or as it was intended to be, a restriction upon the general government. And later on in this show, I'll discuss a case that came out recently saying that assault rifles were not protected by the Second Amendment. So we'll get into that. But you also had an article out that I really liked that said teachers are already armed. So what they're talking about, teachers being armed on campus as a solution, and again, what I've been trying to say, it's the system. It's the school system, the government school system that is a problem. But let's play their game and say, one of the two solutions being talked about is, one, ban the AR-15, two, arming teachers. So we know that many of these teachers have concealed carry permits, and you compare this issue with banning firearms to solving a problem with the war on drugs. I'm going to let you delve into that bit in your article for a few moments.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just go back to the Second Amendment thing very quickly.
Sure.
That whole argument, yes, we could amend the Constitution to change the Second Amendment, make it more limiting on the right to bear arms. But people should understand the reason that there is a Second Amendment. So It's not, we have a Fourth Amendment so the government can't drag us out of our houses and ransack our homes without a warrant that specifically says what they're looking for. Okay, so the government can't do that. We don't have a Second Amendment, to preserve our hunting traditions. We have a Second Amendment because at the time the Constitution was under debate whether states were going to ratify it or not, there was strong opposition to the general government, to the Constitution itself, and a lot of states demanded that a Bill of Rights be put in as a condition of ratifying the Constitution. Now, most of them later ratified with the promise that a Bill of Rights would be offered by the first Congress, which it was. But the Second Amendment is there because of strong suspicion against the very government they had just created, reluctance to even join the Union, okay? And they wanted a provision in there that the government they were creating could never take away their right to bear arms, so they could fight against it if they had to. Okay, so the Second Amendment is about the states and the people waging war against the federal government if they ever felt they needed to. So they did anticipate assault weapons because at the time the musket was the assault weapon that the Army used, and they wanted the citizenry to be armed just like the regular Army. That was the whole point of the Second Amendment, or else they wouldn't have had one. So the argument that, well, they didn't know about assault, yes, they did. The assault weapon at the time was the musket. So then you hear the argument, well, we don't let people have tanks and planes. Well, actually, we do. I mean, there are a lot of rich guys have fighter jets, and people have fleets of tanks, collectors. So this is just not a valid argument. They may not be collecting these because they intend to fight a war with them. But the Second Amendment is very, very expansive. It's not supposed to be limited. And anyone who presents the argument, well, no citizen with an AR-15 could defend themselves against the regular Army, well, tell that to our guys in Afghanistan who are fighting that war in their 18th year against an Army with just assault rifles, a few rocket launchers, no Air Force, no Navy, 18 years, and they still haven't conquered them.
Well,
so
and so
I just wanted to say the Second.
Yes, and that's perfect because when people say, well, clearly then I have a right then to a nuclear bomb. No, that isn't arms. But yes, a lot of people collect tanks. You can buy a P-51 Mustang. And one thing that is hidden in the education system is the preamble. Everybody knows about the preamble to the Constitution. In fact, a statist just quoted it to me yesterday or the other day saying, well, it says we, the people. And I said, what we also have to understand is there is a preamble to the Bill of Rights. And that was intended to let the people know that there is a restriction on the government. The Bill of Rights is a restriction on the general government. We don't hear about the preamble. You never hear people talking about it. It was, again, to reassure them that the government was not going to throw off its yokes and no longer have a beneficent purpose with regards to the people and the states. And when we talk about people being able to rise up against a tyrannical government, again, that was the point of it. What we have now is a tyrannical government rising up against the people. In fact, we did a show on that yesterday. February 27th marked the 25th anniversary of Waco. So we see a government waging war on its people. There was another little incident in the 1860s that where the government did the same thing. So this being able to rise up against another contingent here is a one-way street. The government can do it against us. We were intended to be able to do it against a tyrannical government.
Yeah, and I think also, when people make this argument, well, that people can never fight the Army, they're thinking of these World War II style pitched battles where you're out in some big field or something with tanks maneuvering around like they're watching the movie Patton or something. That's not how warfare is done anymore. And the real practical thing is that if you really wanted to oppress a population, you've got to go door to door kicking in doors the way our military unfortunately did for so many years in Iraq. And if you knew every door had a gun behind it, you might not be quite so eager to do so. There might be some reluctance there to really enforce anything that didn't have to be enforced, or you didn't have complete moral certitude on. So, the idea of having an armed population is more keep the government honest. And we could debate about whether that's necessary now or whether it should be amended or whatever, but at least don't lie about what the Second Amendment is there for. It's very clear.
Exactly, which is why, again, they hide the meanings. And you brought up something about kicking in doors. There are a couple instances where we are seeing people actually are welcoming that happening, if not welcoming it, acquiescing to it. When I lived in California, there was an incident with the shooting of a police officer in the Santa Cruz area. Officers literally went in and stormed houses and neighborhoods looking for the assailant. Now, people will say, well, clearly we needed to find an officer, the assailant of a police officer. These were exigent circumstances, but what surprised me was how accepting people were of law enforcement kicking in doors and searching homes when somebody could have said, this person is not here. I have a right to my privacy and you cannot come in. And they always justify it as some sort of emergency. And you hear this all the time. But what you mentioned in your article, too, is we think that one more regulation, one more law is going to solve a problem once and for all. And you mentioned, for instance, heroin. Heroin is banned, but now one of the national topics of conversation is an opioid crisis. How can that be if heroin's banned?
Yeah, it's the drug war is such a replay of 1920s alcohol prohibition that it's just, sometimes I throw up my hands. I just can't believe that doesn't slap everybody across the face. It's funny that, people overdose on heroin. It's very tragic. But a good majority of the people who die don't die just because they took too much heroin. They die because they got something else with their heroin. They call it a hot load. And it's really a direct parallel to what they used to call bathtub gin, where people went blind, they died, they had organ failure from drinking this gin that was made, in the basement by some guy in a dirty bathtub. That's the caricature of it. But, nobody dies from buying a bottle of gin anymore. When's the last time you heard that? Never. Why? Because it's not prohibited. It's not made by criminals anymore. So, prohibiting the drug actually probably makes it more dangerous. And I'm not talking, because now the government can regulate it. Even without the government regulating it, if it was sold in the light of day by a business you could go visit and sue, then even without regulation, it would become more safer, and it would become also cheaper. The gangs would be put out of business. What are they making their money on? They're making their money at selling drugs. So it's so blatantly obvious that this is a disaster, but there's just always plenty of people that seem to think, we'll just pass a law against it and everything will be fine.
Well, this really takes us into the topic of your book, Where Do Liberals or Conservatives and Liberals Come From? Because it seems like we have this impression that liberals stand for one side of the spectrum and conservatives side with the other. You can say this is left or right. But what I have found, particularly in my research with the national reciprocity, is conservatives, so-called conservatives, are all for handing the general government more power when it comes to firearms. In this instance, regulating concealed carry permits, or mandating that the states recognize them. And this is in direct contravention to the powers enumerated in Congress in Article 1. Most importantly, it's a specific violation of the Second Amendment, which again reiterates the powers of Congress. So what I see here is the conservatives that are cheering on a usurpation of power and breach of their limited power and authority is the same people that were lambasting Obama and the Democrats for the Affordable Care Act, saying there's no constitutional authority. But now what they're saying is, well, now we've got people in charge that we want. We need to move this big government agenda in our direction. And what your book does is point out that there are many instances where there isn't much of a difference between the two. You note a conversation that you had with somebody at a conference. You were attending a conference and you met somebody that was, I guess, in the same building for a Star Wars conference. And I thought that conversation was very illuminating. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, well, it was funny because I was speaking the next day at this political event, and it just worked out so well as a little show starter. But I sat down after a long day, tired, and they got all these people walking around as, you know, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader and stormtroopers and whatever. And this gentleman is dressed up as Obi-Wan, I believe he was, the young version, and he says, "So how are you enjoying the convention?" I said, "Well, I just got here." I said, "Except I'm not here for the same one you are. I'm here for Campaign for Liberty." And he says, "Really, what's that?" I said, "Well," I said, "it's a convention that everybody at your convention should want to join." "Well, why is that?" I said, "Because they're looking to get rid of the empire and restore the old republic." And this guy is looking at me like, "Oh God, do I even want to talk to this guy or not?" So he literally looked at me and he gave me the "come here" sign. He goes, "All right, tell me a little more." Like he's already regretting it. So we talked for a while about the libertarian principles and that kind of thing. And I mean, he was really pretty much on board. I mean, and I think you find that most people who vote liberal or conservative will agree with you on almost everything until you get to their push button point, and all of a sudden it's no way, we got the government regulate that, you know, that's important to me, you know. So I mean, but the point of that story was really that the people that get elected, I mean, forget even that the populace has bad ideas about what they want. Then they elect people who have even worse ideas and don't reflect the will of the so-called majority, which doesn't even exist because minorities elect candidates. So it was an interesting story. He was a good guy. We kept in touch for a while afterwards. But the main point being that the parties don't really reflect the will of the people, but they do reflect, in my opinion, true conservatism and true liberalism. I think that John McCain, Mitt Romney, Donald Trump especially are pure conservatives. Because the idea that conservatism means anything to do with limited government is wrong. When you go back, you know, a little farther than William Buckley, all the conservative philosophers want unlimited government, absolute power. Now, some of them want it divided between local and national, but they want the government to regulate everything, right down to every last move you make. That's conservatism, based on the conservative view that man is fallen, and without everything being regulated, he's going to go berserk and, you know, we're going to kill each other, steal from each other. We'll never keep a contract with each other. That's true conservatism. In the 20th century, classical liberals flocked to the conservative movement when the Democrats left the reservation and became socialists. But that's really not a healthy marriage, because what we call libertarianism today, or classical liberalism, is the exact opposite of conservatism. And it was during the 19th century, they were the two big parties on either side.
And what we're seeing right now is, again, we have, this makes a lot of conservatives mad because they like to think that we are the defenders of freedom. But I find, and for example, now look what we're seeing with Donald Trump saying, I'm going to ban bump stocks through executive order, or first take the guns away, then we will worry about due process. And when I wrote this article on national reciprocity, my good friend Carl Jones was the co-author. And here's something that he just said this morning. This is the problem with electing someone who has no real philosophy on government. You end up with a benevolent dictator. Of course, when you elect someone, as has been the norm for the last 150 years, whose political philosophy is socialistic to one degree or another, the results are even worse. So politicians really aren't the problem now. We have to fix the voters. And how do we do that? With education. That's why I think this book of yours, even though I'm a little late to the party, I know you had it out for a few years, is so important, because what we need to understand is that the labels we are affixing to these politicians really means nothing. And when you say a rhino, Republican in name only, no, you know what? That's exactly what a conservative is. He's not a rhino. That is the heart and soul of modern day conservatism, which is, again, embracing government solutions. You mentioned at the beginning of your book that you talk about the American Creed and the Declaration of Independence, and say that the conservative philosophy is inconsistent with this American Creed. Why don't you explain what you mean there a little bit? This is kind of expounding on what you've been talking about, but this gets a little particular to the point you made in the book.
Well, one thing, I would say I disagree with the people who think Trump's not an ideologue. Trump is a classic conservative. I have an article out there somewhere called "Trump Isn't Hitler, He's Hamilton," because he is. Trump's platform is the same as Hamilton's. In fact, the tariffs, the huge army, got to be so strong nobody would ever dare mess with us. The central bank is kind of a moot point at this point. It's been with us for so long. But those are the tenets of Hamiltonism. And in fact, Hamilton's slogan was national greatness. I kid you not. That's what Hamilton always expounded, we're after national greatness. So the conservative philosophy, and the reason that they come to these conclusions is, as I've said, they believe that without the government being all powerful everywhere, that we are savages. Okay. And you got to read, of course, Thomas Hobbes' famous Leviathan. And many people would stand up and say, "Oh no, Edmund Burke is the founder of modern conservatism." Well, Burke agrees with Hobbes on almost everything. The only thing he disagrees about is the way the government is divided up. Where Hobbes wants an absolute monarch, and Burke would want that power divided. But and Burke, of course, stresses long-standing local legal traditions. But in essence, they both agree on one thing. There can't be any activity out there that somebody isn't regulating, whether it's the king or your local school board or something in between. So the conservative philosophy assumes there are no such things as rights before there's a government. They believe that we just have this savage state of war. Okay, well, so that's in direct contradiction to the so-called American Creed and the Declaration that says those rights already exist in the state of nature, as they say. And that the government's actually created to protect what already exists.
Do we lose our rights of nature, our natural rights in a civilized society? And does the government circumvent those and take over those? Because I know we talked about this on our old network. Jeff is familiar with it, with Mark Cressland's. Every day we interact with people and there is no savagery, there is no violence. And we do this in the absence of government intervention. So what happens to our natural rights when we live in a civilized society?
Well, it's a great question, because it really is the dividing line. Now, the conservatives, all of them, including Edmund Burke, which is in my book, I quote him saying that government's not based on there being any natural rights that you carry into society. They believe they don't exist. We're just savages. Now, on the other hand, the liberals, and a lot of people think, Karl Marx is the guiding light for all liberals, and that's not really true. You've got to read a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And they believe that in the state of nature, we start out, kind of Adam and Eve, blissfully ignorant. But as we acquire property, the problems start arising of inequality and conflict. So what do each of those schools of thought say about what happens when we enter society? The conservative philosophy says, well, the rights are only come into existence once there's a government to protect us from ourselves. So they don't believe there are pre-existing rights. The liberals, if you read Rousseau, says that upon entering society, the individual has to undergo a total alienation of all his natural rights and submission to the general will, which means you give them all up. And it's great that Rousseau uses that word because it's the same word that is in our Declaration that says the rights are inalienable. So you can cross off everybody under that column. And of course, you can cross off the conservative movement, and you really got to go, starting with John Locke, not that he doesn't have his own predecessors, and follow that idea forward. And actually, there's a lot of proof that, especially Jefferson and a lot of the founders were reading Locke very closely and basing a lot of what they thought on his way of thinking.
Before I let you go, because I know you have something to take care of, but as you were speaking in this last section here, I had actually circled Rousseau right before you brought his name up, and I had written in my notes that he had said education is a vital role of government. I feel that education is the responsibility of the parents, and we should have the freedom to educate our children in a means by which we choose. But here is his justification for it, because we want a virtuous society, and it is the role of government education systems to teach virtue. Now fast forward to what we have today, and we can see how absolutely ludicrous that proposition is. Also, when you mention entering into a social contract or a contract within a society, we surrender our unalienable rights for the benefits of living within this structured society. You know what, Tom? I don't recall entering into any contract. You are born now into this pre-existing society. I did not sign up for anything. You're expected to pay your property taxes wherever you move. If you can find a place where I don't have to sign up for a contract and give up my rights, please tell me. I will pack up and move today.
Yeah, well, the idea that, the idea that just because you're born, you're automatically agreeing to all kinds of things is kind of ludicrous on its face. And the whole thing with education is not just a liberal thing. Certainly, Rousseau, Marx, everybody is open that the government has to control education to teach you the right political ideas. The conservatives believe the same thing. That's why they're always trying to get, quote unquote, God back in our schools. And unfortunately, even Jefferson made this mistake, as libertarian as his thinking was on some things. He actually stated right before he died, oh, well, if we're going to have this state-funded institution or partially state-funded, then we need to make sure that we know we're teaching them Locke and Sidney as far as politics goes. So he wanted to use the state to brainwash them as libertarians. So think about that as an oxymoron. So
that's
nobody's 100% consistent.
I found that problematic as well, just because, again, this goes back to national reciprocity versus the Affordable Care Act. We like the big government mandates that we agree with, and we will stand up and vehemently pound our keyboard against those we disagree with. Tom Mullen, how can people get a hold of you? How can they find your books? What is your website? I think it's tommullen.net.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm not the only author named Tom Mullen, so you have to go to tommullen.net, and I usually link to, I write pretty regularly these days for the Foundation for Economic Education. So you can find me over there, but you can also get there by going through my website. I've got links to my books, and there's also articles I write that are not published elsewhere on my blog at tommullen.net.
Yeah, I really admire your works, and I'm just so delighted that you accepted my invitation to come and talk to me today and enlighten my listeners as to what your philosophies are. I appreciate you're doing the heavy lifting and following a lot of the insanity in Washington, D.C., because I can just cut to the chase and read your commentary. So thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Mullen, spelled Mullen. Look for him and find, I would suggest you get his books. You can get them on Kindle. I found this one about conservatives and liberals to be absolutely fascinating, and I could have conducted a 3-hour interview on this topic alone. But Tom, we will let you go. Jeff, we will cut to a break, and then when we come back, I have a few other things I want to talk about a recent federal court hearing and their misinterpretation of the Second Amendment, and a few stories about nullification and federalism. We'll be right back. This is the Wasatch Report on the Cerberus Radio Network, defending liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny.
Paul, are these two men in the middle insufficiently conservative for you?
Well, I think that the problem is nobody's to define what being conservative means. And I think that is our problem. Conservatives means we have smaller government and more liberty. And yet, if you ask what have we done, I think we've lost our way completely. Our rhetoric is still pretty good. But when we get in charge, we expand the government. You talk about Dodd-Frank, but we gave Sarbanes-Oxley. We gave debts as well, you know, when we're in charge. So if it means limited government, you have to ask a basic question: what should the role of government be? The founders asked that question, had a revolution, wrote a constitution. And they said the role of government ought to be to protect liberty. It's not to run a welfare state and not to be the policeman of the world. And so if you're going conservative, how can you be conservative and cut food stamps, but you won't cut spending overseas? There's not a nickel or penny that anybody will cut on the conservative side overseas spending, and we don't have the money. They're willing to start more wars. So I say if you're conservative, you want small government across the board, especially in personal liberty. What's wrong with having the government out of our personal lives? So this is what we have to decide: what conservative means, what limited government means. And I have a simple suggestion. We have a pretty good guide, and if we follow the Constitution, government would be very small, and we would all be devoted conservatives.
Cerberus Radio Network, protecting liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny.
All right, everybody, welcome back after the break. It's always a mad dash to get my coffee warmed up and get back in time from these quick breaks. So thank you for your patience. If you missed the first segment of the show, I was interviewing Tom Mullen, who is the author of Where Do Conservatives and Liberals Come From? He has a website, Tom Mullen, MULLEN.net. And he is a prolific writer for many sources, and I suggest you follow him. And if you missed the first part of the segment, go back. We will have it up on YouTube, and the show will be replayed also in its entirety at, I believe, 8 o'clock tonight. Jeff, what did you think about what he had to say?
Oh, I agree completely with him. I mean, when he said that conservatives are just about big government, I messaged you. I said, well, they're all about conserving government. So when you say you're conservative, what are you conserving? And obviously, conservatives today conserve government. So he was right. He was right on, and it was funny. I picked that break early this morning when I set everything up about Ron Paul and conservatism. So it was kind of funny that it all worked out. I mean, it played right in well with with your guest.
Yeah, I thought so too. I want to share with you an article. This was published on the 27th, and federal court, and I thought we had actually had a decision on this as well, or maybe this has just been the topic of the conversation, but I sent you this article. Federal court quietly rules assault rifles, I really hate that term, but I'm quoting here, are not protected by the Second Amendment. And, you know, as you and I are going through this, we can kind of roll our eyes because we know where they're going with this. Well, this was out of Annapolis, Maryland. While Americans watched the 2018 Olympics. I did not 1 nanosecond of it. And the mainstream media put on scripted town hall meetings to demonize law-abiding citizens who own guns. The Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia, handed down a blow to the Second Amendment. Isn't it sad that part of the birthplace of our union here, Virginia, with such amazing thinkers we had coming out of Virginia, has just taken such an about face now? I shudder to think what their response would be if they saw what was going on in their old nation of Virginia. Anyway, in a 10-4 ruling, a federal court ruled that the state of Maryland's ban on 45 different assault weapons and its 10-round limit for magazines was not a violation of the citizens' constitutional rights. The ruling was not without harsh dissent, however. Okay, this is the problem. First of all, we have a federalism issue, and we have an issue of how we understand the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. First of all, as we know, the Second Amendment, and I mentioned this in the first segment, and I say this all the time, the Second Amendment confers no rights upon us as citizens. Tom Mullen, just like I said, go back, listen to what he had to say about this. The Second Amendment was there to make sure that the people could always throw off a tyrannical government. It does not say we have the right to have guns for deer hunting or any other purpose. Remember, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It does not say a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. This document heretofore grants the right of the people to keep and bear arms. There's a significant difference. The discussion that we have really bears upon the second statement I just gave you. And the first would mean that the court would say, you know what, first of all, we have absolutely no jurisdiction over hearing this matter. Second of all, because this matter was never delegated to us, it is reserved to the states. So not only does the federal judiciary have no right to hear about this because they're prohibited on regulating firearms, period, but this is a 10th Amendment matter. So if a state decides to ban, and this is consistent with their Constitution, if it is consistent with their Constitution, then that's Maryland's problem. People in Maryland need to effectuate a change, vote in different representatives. If it violates Maryland's Constitution, then the proper forum for redress is in the state courts of Maryland. Running to the federal judiciary will only result in nationalistic firearms laws. Again, that is a direct contravention to our founding principles. Getting back to the article, and I'm going to quote somebody here, put simply, we have no power to extend Second Amendment protections to weapons of war, Judge Robert Kling wrote to the court, adding that the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, another case that Scalia got wrong, actually, explicitly excluded such coverage, according to NBC. It's unthinkable that these weapons of war, weapons that cause the carnage in Newton, oh, here we go with the hyperbole and the emotionalism and the ad hominem, cause the carnage in Newton and in other communities across the country would be protected by the Second Amendment. Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh, who spearheaded the movement, said, so here we have some pretty high-ranking attorneys that have absolutely no comprehension of, first of all, the Constitution as it pertains to federalism. Second of all, the Constitution as it pertains to the Second Amendment. And this is the problem with lawyers and the constitutional principles. If you want to hear somebody get it wrong, listen to a law school constitutional law professor. Then compare to what one of these people say to, for instance, a historian who also happens to be an attorney, somebody like Kevin Gutzman. Read his book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, because I refer to what we are taught in law school. I mentioned the Bill of Rights and the preamble to the Bill of Rights in our discussion with Tom Mullen. I majored in political science, field of concentration, public law at UCLA. Also went to law school afterwards, got my JD, passed the California bar exam. Never once did we mention the preamble to the Bill of Rights. We don't really discuss federalism. As I've said before, when you're studying for the bar exam and you take a bar review course, we have this one day is called multi-state. The multi-state section of the bar exam is all multiple choice questions. What they teach you, if you have an option between choosing the 14th Amendment, which we are taught applies now the Bill of Rights to the states in direct contravention to systems of federalism and what was ratified in the system of government that we consented to, the ratifying states consented to. If you have a choice between the 14th Amendment and the 10th Amendment is always the wrong answer. In reality, the 10th Amendment is always the right answer. But this is what I call the malfeasance of the legal education system. Who is the beneficiary for this? The general government, the national government, not the federal government. It's a national government. Again, they also play with the words to obfuscate the truth and our origins and intentions. In NBC reports, Judge William Traxler issued a dissent. Let's see what he has to say. By concluding the Second Amendment doesn't even apply, the majority has gone to greater lengths than any other court to eviscerate the constitutionally guaranteed rights to keep and bear arms. Again, it's not a guarantee, it is a restriction. And you could say it guarantees our rights, but they guarantee it by implying that we are given our rights by the Constitution, and that is not right. So let me go back to his quote. It should at least be subject to strict scrutiny before it's allowed to stand. Well, he just contradicted himself. He's saying that we can have a right to keep and bear arms provided we have this constitutional, this judicial fairy dust standard called strict scrutiny, meaning if this law is narrowly defined and fulfills a compelling government purpose, to hell with the Second Amendment. That is his dissent. That's outrageous. Elizabeth Bannock, executive director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, says the ruling is overwhelming proof that reasonable measures to prevent gun violence are constitutional, adding that it doesn't go far enough. Again, if Maryland wants to do this, that's fine, but the feds need to stay out. Maryland's law needs to become here we go. Gosh, Jeff, this is really painful. Maryland's law needs to become a national model of evidence-based policies that will reduce gun violence. Jeff, we had an assault rifle ban. I think it started in 2004 after the Sunset Clause and it expired. Did we see an overwhelming or any increase at all in gun violence with assault rifles?
No, he didn't, and I believe it started under Clinton. So that wasn't that passed in the 90s? Mm-hmm. The guns, the ban, and it expired under Bush.
And we have not seen a jump in crime now that these weapons of war are allowed on our streets. Speaking of weapons of war, have you seen your local county SWAT team? We have police forces all around this continental landmass that have become militarized. And what these people don't understand is the absolute stupidity in allowing the government to have a monopoly on weapons of war or means of defense. These people are absolutely crazy, particularly now in light of the fact that everybody they hate is in charge of the general government. We have Republicans, they cannot stand the GOP in charge of both houses of Congress and one in the White House. And they say, you know what, we hate guns so much, we want to turn them over to the people we hate. Going back to the article, the court entirely ignored the Supreme Court case of Columbia versus Heller, which determined that the Second Amendment protects weapons that are in common use at the time for lawful purposes like self-defense. I don't mean to sound crude here, but Scalia pulled that one right out of his rear end. There is no evidence for this. Every time a lunatic who usually goes on some mind-altering pharmaceutical goes on a shooting rampage, the do-gooders in Washington, with the aid of their citizen flocks, take to the TV and the internet and call for disarming of the American people. Now, what I like about this article is they do mention these psychotropic drugs. Remember, I did a show with that on February 21st. Please go to our YouTube channel, find that show, February 21st, the Wasatch Report, with Dr. Mary Ann Block of the Block Center in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The common denominator of these killers is they have mental issues. Going to these mental expanded background checks is not enough. We need to look at what is causing these problems. Pharmaceutical industry, in lockstep with the general government, in lockstep with the education system. By the way, these kids are systems of revenue generation for the schools. If we can get these kids determined, classified as having an issue that needs these medications, the schools get money. The media, again, trifecta of evil here: government, media, education system. It's all right here. We're the only ones talking about it. Okay? So the media is covering it because of the advertisers. The advertisers, Dr. Block told me she had been told that she could not be on some of these mainstream media shows because the advertisers wouldn't tolerate her message. Her message is the truth. We return to the article. The citizens who call for themselves and their neighborhoods to be disarmed likely think no deeper than the shallow speeches given by the political blowhards designed to appeal to emotion only. And that's really what we're seeing here, Jeff, is people are just appealing to emotions. There's no rational thought in this debate. And that's why we do what we do over here. They do not think that weapons happen during and after government attempts to remove guns from society. They do not think what happens, I'm sorry. They also completely ignore the fact that criminals do not obey the laws, and making guns illegal would have zero effect on criminals passing guns. Let me go back to Scalia's interpretation, where he said that the weapons had to be in common use at the time. You can have a gun that is esoteric, that is rare. Does that now mean that you no longer have a right to own that firearm? There is absolutely no justification for his ruling. What he is doing is what we see all the time on both sides, is a justice creating law out of thin air. They legislate it from the bench and try to tailor it to suit an outcome that they like. Okay, well, Scalia supports the Second Amendment, so he says, so what he's going to do is come up with a palatable way that will make people accept his version of it without an out riot from the left. See, if that were me on the Supreme Court, I would say, we will not be hearing this case. We have no authority to do so. I would strike down every single federal firearms law and mind my own business when it came to state firearms laws, which is why you'll never see me sitting on a bench anywhere. And, you know, I'm going to wrap up this article as well. The other thing, too, is we accept Scalia's, and we turn to Heller when now we have the incorporation. We can thank also the NRA for this, as you know, Jeff, where we had the city of McDonald. And that case, the city of McDonald, or the city of Chicago versus McDonald, which brought into which applied the Second Amendment to the states. Again, the states always had the exclusive power to regulate firearms. So we have now a case that says the assault rifles are not covered, protected by the Second Amendment. Again, this clearly goes in direct contravention to our founding principles and the heart and soul and intention of the Second Amendment, which was to have weapons of war equivalent to those of the government to fight off a tyrannical government should it no longer suit our purposes or fulfill its justifiable fulfill its only proper role is to secure our liberties. Jeff, did you want to have anything to say about that before I move on?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well. I mean, we've really talked about the Second Amendment quite often. I think people understand now that it isn't giving rights and that it's an absolute restriction. And that's one thing I always try to put on there, that it's an absolute restriction. It means that every federal firearms law is unconstitutional. Which protects your liberty better? Demanding a civil right that they can regulate or take away, or an absolute restriction that means they can't regulate it at all? I mean, come on. I mean, just be honest with yourself. Stop buying the NRA version of the Constitution and actually apply what the framers said and did.
Yeah, and this just goes to show that, again, conservatives and liberals really aren't too far off base from each other, because they both embrace large government. In fact, I'm not going to have time to get into the 3 stories of nullification. We'll save that for the next show. But let me share with you before we wrap up the show we have. I was in Salt Lake City the other day, and a young lady approached me and asked if I was registered to vote. And I said, yes, I am. She takes out her little cardboard notepad and says, well, here, her clipboard, would you be interested in signing a petition to put on the ballot an initiative to expand qualifications for children to get covered on Utah's government supplied healthcare program? And I looked at her and I said, well, can you answer this question for me? What is the proper role of government? Blank stare, deer with the, staring at the headlights, everything. And I said, what is the proper role of government? Well, I said, it's to secure our liberties. So do you think that the government providing health care to somebody, to individuals of any age, is in pursuant of our liberties, protecting our liberties? Her response was, well, I don't think people should be on state assistance permanently, but I think temporarily it should help. I said, okay, fair enough. Who pays for this initiative? Where does the money come from this? She says, well, the government. I said, well, from where? What is the source of government revenue? And she said, taxpayers. I said, okay, now we're on to something here. Is paying taxes voluntary? And she says, no. I said, okay. So if I decide not to pay my taxes, eventually somebody's going to show up with a gun pointed at me at my house. They might not come out with guns blaring, but they're going to tell me your house is being sold because you did not pay your property taxes or your income taxes, whatever. We are going to force you now to pay. If I defy them, those guns are going to come out and be raised at me. I said, so what you're asking me to do is, under threat of a gun, to cough up money that I have earned and use it to pay for medical insurance for people I've never even met. Now, do you think that is moral? Do you think that is ethical? And I said, what you don't understand is you are young enough to bear witness and to pay the price for these policies you are advocating. I hope I will be long gone before everything you want to have happen comes to fruition. But what you need to recognize is you are standing there next to a sapling, watering and fertilizing a tree that has a rope hanging from a little branch. And there's a noose at the end of this rope, and it is around your neck. When this tree grows up, when your little socialist, Marxist, indoctrinated plans and dreams come to fruition, you will be the one hanging from this rope. When that happens to you or your progeny and your universal disarmament of citizens and the ramifications all come about, you remember this crazy lady you had a conversation with in Salt Lake City one day and said, by golly, she was right. We are the ones trying to warn you about this, everybody. Want to thank you for listening. This is the Wasatch Report. I'm Suzanne Sherman on the Cerberus Radio Network, doing our best to defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny.